Welcome to the How We Can Heal podcast. My name is Lisa Danilchuk, and I'm a psychotherapist specializing in complex trauma treatment. I'm a graduate of UCLA and Harvard University, and I'm thrilled to share these reflections on how we can heal with you today. Today, our guest is Dr. Simone Reinders. Dr. Reinders is a leader and international expert in the neurobiology of dissociation. Her research has been pivotal in deepening our understanding of dissociative identity disorder, or DID, and was the first to provide evidence that DID is related to early traumatization. She's also a senior research associate and lecturer at the Department of Psychological Medicine in the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London. Dr. Reinders was among the first to publish studies on brain imaging and pathological dissociation. Her research was the first to show, on the basis of brain activation data, that different personality states in patients with dissociative identity disorder show different brain activation patterns in response to trauma-related cues. In an important follow-up study, she showed that these patterns cannot be simulated. Dr. Reinders has also used structural data to show that DID and post-traumatic stress disorder share neurostructural biomarkers, which we'll talk about today. We also talk about how Dr. Reinders' work can aid the diagnosis of DID, which also points to how machine learning could even assist in the diagnostic process. I connected with Dr. Reinders after a talk she gave for the ISSTD years ago and wish everyone were aware of her research and findings, which after this episode, you will be. Let's welcome Dr. Reinders to the show. I am so happy to have you here on the How We Can Heal podcast. I have been lucky to hear you present before to the ISSTD, and your research is phenomenal. And I think everyone needs to hear about it, learn about it, read it, study it, understand it. So I'm excited to today at least start a conversation, because I think there are some folks listening who know your research well and will be excited to hear from you, and some folks who haven't heard your name or your research before. And so I'm so excited to just share this because it's really powerful stuff. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for having me. It's a great honor to be able to do this with you.
So I always have just this curiosity. I always want to know the origin story. How did you get into this work? What led you to study the brain biomarkers of dissociation?
Well, I need to go very far back. I think it's now almost 25 years. And I was, as a student, I was looking for a thesis project to complete my studies at the University in Groningen. At that time, I was studying artificial intelligence after I've done some physics studies as well. So more methodological based approach to where I am now. But through my studies of artificial intelligence, I learned about brain imaging. We're talking about 1997, 1998. So it was still all coming up. And when I was looking for a thesis project, I was made aware about a project at the Department of Psychiatry with Professor Korf. And this project was in collaboration with Dr. Nijenhuis, whom hopefully some of the readers will have heard of, because he has developed a large theoretical body for theory on dissociative identity disorder, and he wanted to do brain imaging research. And initially, I was mostly interested in the methodology of brain imaging and on how to analyze the data, and especially on how to analyze the data correctly, because it's easy to put in the data and then some blobs come out, but it's very important to understand that you're doing the right thing and running the right test. But once I got the hang of that, I became more and more fascinated by DID, dissociative identity disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and especially dissociation.
And I know some folks listening may have heard the term somatoform dissociation, which I know comes from some of Ehlert Nijenhuis's work. So they might be familiar in that way, even if not with the name. So You've done a ton of research. I know some of it's really groundbreaking. As I said, some people might not be as familiar with your work. Can you give us a summary of like what have you and the students in your lab accomplished in these years as you've started to study the brain biomarkers of dissociation and complex trauma?
My very, very first research publication was based on my thesis from my university studies. And I think that is also one of the most important papers that I published together with Dr. Nijenhuis. And this research paper was done with an imaging technique that is called positron emission tomography, because it was an early technique, 1998, like I just said. And this study showed that different brain activation patterns were linked to different identity states in individuals with dissociative identity disorder.
So you had people with dissociative identity disorder go into the PET scan, and you saw that when they switched an identity, there were different brain biomarkers of those identities.
I need to take that a small step further, because what is important there is that they were listening to an autobiographical text.
Okay.
So this type of studies is called a symptom provocation paradigm or symptom provocation study. So we wanted to induce symptoms in different identity states. So we used the same text in a trauma avoidant state and in a trauma aware state that I also refer to as a neutral identity state and a trauma identity state. So when the text is the same and the identity state differs, we see different brain activation patterns in the brain. And this has challenged the core of the understanding of the existence of DID. We showed using objective measures that different identity states within one individual show different brain activation patterns on the same text.
So they're being introduced to the same stimuli and they're having different brain patterning responses.
That is a fantastic summary, Lisa. Thank you for that.
Well, and I think it's important with this type of work. I feel like, we live in a world where people talk a lot about dissociation and the extreme forms of it in terms of dissociative identity and dissociative identity disorder. And I feel like the larger clinical world, the larger mental health world is just picking up on some of this in terms of what is dissociation, what can it look like? And it's so fascinating to me when we get this kind of data because it's so tangible. And so much of this work can feel intangible and confusing and amorphous and overwhelming. And so when you say, oh, we exposed them to the same, image or narrative, and there were different brain pattern responses from different states, that I feel like is something, even now we're maybe looking at brain scans. It's not like you can kind of hold a brain scan in your hand or you look at a picture of it, right? It makes it more, I think, comprehensible for folks who maybe haven't studied dissociation or haven't, to their knowledge, worked with someone with DID.
For me, from a methodological point, it's also important for me to say that when they listen to a neutral text that does not include any trauma cues, then there was no difference in brain activation patterns between the identity states. So this makes it's like a control condition, because then they still listen to a text, but there's no trauma information in, so there's no difference in brain activation patterns. But as soon as they got the trauma triggers, then the brain, in the trauma state, the brain goes in overdrive with emotional responses and limbic activation, while in that trauma avoidant state, we see no amygdala, less limbic activation, and especially higher cognitive areas, as if they their brain says, okay, we need to process this information differently. We need to process it by dissociating, not allowing it to enter our conscious awareness.
And I feel like this is such an important point for folks to get in a broad way, which is when we talk about trauma, there's that activation response, even neurologically in our brains, the amygdala response, you might see certain patterning or heightened activity. And then when we go really how I think of it further into trauma or more complex, more horrific experiences, not everyone, but many people then go to this more trauma avoidance state where you see less activity, where it's more of a shutdown, or people might say hypoarousal, but you really see this in brain scans. So we see it as, myself as a clinician, I see it in front of me, or I hear it come up in stories, but it's amazing that you can also measure it in this way. And I think the two sides of that coin, people are picking up on, okay, PTSD and maybe triggers and hyperarousal or nightmares or intrusions, but there's this whole other side of the coin that can exist within the same person of shutdown, numbing, avoidance, however we want to call it. We can see it in our brain activity, and I think that's really powerful.
Yes. So I think what is important to understand is the shutting down does not mean shutting down brain activation. What it means, the emotional processing is being shut down.
Yes.
But for the brain to be able to shut down this emotional processing, brain areas need to be activated to suppress this emotional arousal. So in my view, it is an active cognitive process that is running in the brain to be able to dissociate from these horrible memories.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, right? Because we tend to think, I think, in a little of a binary, hyperarousal, hypoarousal, as I was saying earlier. And this gets more nuanced, right? When you're really looking inside of what's happening in someone's brain, you can see this. Would it be fair to call it like a cognitive override or something like that?
The terminology that you use, hyperarousal and hypoarousal, refers to the emotional reactions.
Yes.
For me, it does not refer to what is happening in the brain.
Right.
Because in my research, I actually see more brain activation during hypoarousal.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That is so interesting. So what has been most challenging for you in your research? I'd imagine some of this is, you find things that maybe have more nuance or go against maybe a more simple way of thinking that we might bring, and then you've got to communicate that. But what are some of the challenges you've seen?
Most challenging in my research have been the review or comments.
Interesting.
And especially my earlier papers, I've received lengthy comments or immediate rejection. Some papers I had to resubmit 5 or 6 times before we were able to publish. I even had one reviewer who said, DID does not exist, so I do not understand the purpose of this paper.
Wow.
And then it gets rejected, and you just have to continue, because I know that with how I analyze my data, with methodological rigor, we had expert clinicians involved, that it was just true. So I just was determined, I persevered, and then at some point I was able to publish the research. And then, the second most challenging is currently trying to get funded.
Yes.
And this is, well, it's in the same line, probably anxiety of funding bodies, or choosing more accepted disorders like psychosis to fund. Even if I get excellent and exceptional evaluations on my research proposals, the funding bodies decide not to fund me. But yeah, that can be very challenging.
Do you have a sense of why dissociation is so hard for folks to understand in a broader way?
I think it's still the historical perspective on DID.
Mm-hmm. Which is so ironic because your research basically disproves the fantasy model of DID, which is what makes it so powerful, but you still end up submitting a paper to someone who says something like, well, DID doesn't exist. So while you have the evidence of...
Yes, well, this was for my earlier research. Fortunately, I do not get...
You don't get that anymore.
No, it's interesting because it has really changed. Now, when I now get reviewer comments, mostly they are very constructive.
Right.
Yeah, reviews are usually very helpful, and I can really see that there's an effort on making the paper better. And sometimes I can sense they're not in the field, and then I just have to add a bit more clarification. So fortunately, this has changed. Now I hope that the funding bodies will follow at some point.
So I have thoughts about this, but I'm wondering what you feel like has been your greatest discovery through research to date.
I tell you mine if you tell me yours after
Yes,
this.
I will. I'll tell you.
For me, the greatest discovery is that I used structural data to show that smaller hippocampal volumes in PTSD and DID are related to a history of childhood traumatization.
Okay.
And why is this my greatest discovery? Is because I think that these findings provide evidence for a childhood trauma-related etiology for smaller hippocampal volume in PTSD and DID patients.
Yeah.
Through this work that my PhD student, Dr. Chalavi, did together with the team, this data research provided neuroanatomical evidence for the clinical observation that DID is related to severe childhood trauma, and it is indicative of an etiology related to childhood maltreatment for this disorder.
Does that then connect? Because I know one of your most popular papers is comparing a fantasy model to a childhood trauma-based model of dissociation. Is that folding into that then?
There are two legs to that research. The first one is brain activation studies. And first, we showed the different activation patterns between identity state that we talked about earlier. The follow-up study was to show that these cannot be enacted and are not related to fantasy proneness. But this is still brain activation. Critics could still say, oh, this is due to some role playing or lying because we did not control for lying or whatever. It's brain activation. People can influence neurofeedback, that whole idea behind it. Yeah. From how I have done my research and my analysis, I know that this is not the case, but skeptics can still think otherwise. However, when you look at the brain, the structural tissue of the brain, that is not, you cannot simulate that. It is just what it is.
Yeah.
So when we use brain structure as a biomarker for a trauma-related origin of DID, that is more solid evidence. I must say that this is, of course, all based on correlation analysis, and I have not shown causality in this study.
Yeah.
However, there have been other studies in the general population that show that trauma is related to smaller hippocampal volume.
Yeah.
If we then find smaller hippocampal volume in a sample of PTSD and DID that have been exposed to early childhood traumatization, and there is a correlation between these measures of traumatization and small hippocampal volume, this builds a strong case for a trauma model for DID.
And it makes sense ethically speaking, in terms of causation studies, people aren't going to go, control group and then put people through horrific trauma and see if it impacts their hippocampus. That's not going to be a thing.
No, there are a few studies that have followed people who have experienced medical trauma.
Hmm.
So that would be a line of research, but personally, its ethical issues are very difficult
Yeah.
in studies like that. And this is why what we have to do with doing correlational studies with knowledge that has been obtained in general populations or in other disorders.
So what's been the most surprising for you through your research?
The most surprising, perhaps you don't expect this, but my most surprising result is the results from a pattern recognition study that was published in 2019 in the British Journal of Psychiatry. And in that pattern recognition study, we found that people with DID can be distinguished from healthy controls at an individual level using math, statistical methodology, and methods. And what was most surprising is that the sensitivity and the specificity of this differentiation was around 72-73%.
Wow.
And then, if you look at the literature, you find that this level of accuracy is actually comparable to what has been demonstrated for most psychiatric disorders, including psychosis. And I found that very surprising, a powerful result as well. The surprising aspect of this finding is that the computer can actually tell us,
Yeah.
on the basis of a brain scan, if it is somebody with DID or a healthy control.
Yeah.
There's no clinician involved.
That's powerful. I mean, that's where we start going in the direction, which gets a little scary in my mind, but like of machine learning and being able to differentiate these things.
Can be very useful for differential diagnostics.
Differential diagnosis, or it can help with misdiagnosis. I know I've been in a lot of conversations lately
Yes.
about differentiating psychosis from dissociation or dissociative identity disorder, differentiating schizophrenia, right? So I think when these types of discoveries and work like yours is shared and people understand it more, they at least know where to go and get those, brain scans, and then we can say, oh, now we have help in understanding what is the etiology, where is this coming from, and then we can decide, well, what's the best course of treatment. And if we're seeing a smaller hippocampus and we're seeing these biomarkers of dissociation and we're picking up on things relationally that feel like psychosis, it helps us sort of either separate apart or blend together what we're understanding, so we can go, oh, this is more of a complete picture of what's happening for this person. And then we can respond to what's actually happening for them rather than our limited information or our misdiagnosis.
Exactly. I think machine learning and pattern classification techniques are very important and very powerful. And I would like to point out that there is also a study based on brain functional brain scans that was conducted in Harvard by Doctors Kaufman and Lebois. And they were also able to show differences between patient groups on the basis of their brain scans. Those are functional brain scans. I have done anatomical brain scans, but it is very important that different groups across the world independently find results that support each other.
Absolutely. And that's what's been happening with a lot of your research, right? I know Dr. Melissa Kaufman, Dr. Lauren Lebois, over at McLean at Harvard, they've done some of their own studies. They've replicated some things. I feel like other people have replicated some of the work that you've done. And the more that we independently find similar findings, the stronger the research body gets.
absolutely. I mean, it's nice and very exciting to be a pioneer in your field,
Mhm.
but if that doesn't mean anything if follow-up studies don't show the same result. And I feel very grateful that other people are undertaking this follow-up research, and the group from Harvard has done excellent research and very important for other centers and other groups to do this research as well.
So what are some of the big takeaways from research you've done that people have replicated that you feel like really has started to create a foundational understanding around trauma and dissociation? Like, what do you wish anyone listening who might not be a mental health professional or not have studied or read these type of research papers, what do you wish they knew and they could take away from the years and the decades of research that you've done and that people have replicated? There's a shift in our foundational understanding there. I'm wondering if you can articulate that.
The DID is a genuine disorder and it's not enacted. DID is not what you see on the television or in those Marvel comic things. And I have given interviews on that to try to reach the more general audience and make them aware that this is not helpful for people who suffer from DID. So what I wish is that more people in the general public knew is that DID is a genuine disorder and that these people have actually suffered through tremendous trauma, and it's not a fancy tweak that you see in a comic movie or in all these crime movies. Like there was a case in CSI, and you see them frequently popping up on the television, but that is not what the idea is about.
Mm,
The idea is about a survival mechanism.
yes.
And I wish that the general audience would understand that and just not go and see these movies with where the idea is portrayed in as exciting, because having the idea is not exciting. Nobody wants to have this disorder, and also see it more and more on social media because these cases get a lot of attention, they get a lot of followers. There was a case presented at the Maudsley at King's, a flamboyant case seeking the confirmation that they have the disorder.
Hmm.
Fortunately, the Maudsley has a well-trained trauma dissociation clinic, and they were not able to confirm the diagnosis.
Yeah, that opens up a whole can of worms. I know there's a lot of conversations happening in around social media. There's a lot of education. There's a lot of questions, and I know just even in the last year or so that sort of differential diagnosis piece has been a hot topic, especially around social media. And there's been a lot of conversation about self-diagnosis and things like that, which is again why I feel like your research is so powerful, because even in this case you're sharing, someone who's going, is this what I have? Right? Help me figure it out. They can, I mean, if they have the resources and access to the right institution and supports, they can do a brain scan and get a sense of what does this look like compared to other brain scans we have? And can that help me understand myself? Can that help me understand and my treatment team understand what's best if I'm seeking some form of healing, what's going to get me there? So this is just another reason I feel like your research is so important. And it makes me become aware as you're talking that not all mental health diagnoses have this level, this depth of study, right? You said some are more well-funded, perhaps psychosis, or I'm guessing schizophrenia. But I think about things like the most common referrals most psychotherapists get are anxiety and depression. And there's a ton of research in those areas, but I don't think there's the level of correlation that you've picked up on in terms of brain structure. Do you know of any other mental health condition that has this level of etiological study?
I think for DID is unique for having to provide proof that the disorder is not enacted. When somebody who says that they have depression or anxiety, they go to a GP or to a psychologist or psychiatrist, and nobody will tell them, "Oh, you're just enacting your disorder. Your disorder is this. Your disorder does not exist." From that perspective, is unique.
If you had unlimited funding, what research would you do next?
The research, what I would like to do are treatment outcome studies.
Yeah.
People who go into treatment at the start and then during treatment, taking biological measures, and then at the end of treatment, how has their brain changed? Is there any change? What is the effect of treatment on the brain? There are no neurobiological studies with methodological rigor that have shown effect of treatment outcome. The other research I would like to do is studying neurotransmitters involved
Yes.
in the brain, because the idea needs to be, it's all about the whole brain works on the basis of neurotransmitters. So the identity state regulation and switches, neurotransmitters must be involved.
Yes.
And I'm very keen to understand which neurotransmitters are involved.
Yes.
And once we know this, how can this knowledge help in treatment?
Yeah. It makes me think of the general understanding we have, again, going back to just the sort of basic hyperarousal, hypoarousal. We have this general understanding that in hyperarousal, there's adrenaline and cortisol and all these things. And then that in dissociation, there's more of a like endogenous opioid response. But again, that's really general, and it's not looking at the function and the interaction that's happening, like perhaps during a switch or perhaps during healing, right? That would be so fascinating. And I hope you get that. How many bake sales do we have to have to get that funding for your work? I'm actually curious because I've stepped out of the world of research. I mean, I did it in grad school and decided to focus more clinically, but like what level of grant would give you that permission to do some of that research? How much money does it take to run these studies?
I think my last grant application, I applied for around 800, 900,000 pounds.
Okay.
And then we would need around 60 individuals with DID.
Yeah.
And then we have control groups. And that would also include salary for a postdoc.
Yes.
And part-time salary for myself, because I'm determined to keep publishing the data that I have at the moment.
Yeah.
It is strenuous to do that, without proper funding and employment.
Right. I mean, publication becomes its own full-time job, especially when you get 5 revisions or notes back and, things where you really have to dive in. And so it's a lot you've been carrying.
Yeah, that has been challenging, but I think I'm also still supervising 2 PhD students who are also self-funded. I want to support them through their thesis. And of course, the participants in my studies, they have donated their time.
Yeah.
And most importantly, they have donated their energy, the energy that they have given and the time that they have given to do the research, to undertake the research that my team has asked them to do. Be in the scanner for 2 sessions and doing all the questionnaires. So I keep that in mind as well when I sit down and I do my data analysis and I write the papers. So I do as much as I can on that. But it would be helpful if at some point there will be funding for my research, and my research team, to be able to build further on what I've done.
So it sounds like if you got let's just say like £1 million grant, that you could move forward with some of these things we're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. I'm just going to put that out there. I don't know if any listeners are working for foundations. I know we have some listeners who work in philanthropy. So just going to put that out there. And how do you think that would help, that understanding of dissociation would help, let's just say someone with PTSD with a dissociative subtype or something, and they're going in for counseling, or, how would that help us as individuals or as a society to have some of that treatment outcome research, some of that neurotransmitter research done?
That is going to work on two levels. Personal well-being of the individual suffering from dissociation,
Mm-hmm.
but also the societal burden, financially, but also mental health care. Because at the moment, and I also wrote about that in my 2019 paper, the pattern recognition paper, there are other studies who cite this as well, that currently with somebody who suffers from dissociation, like a severe PTSD involving dissociation, dissociative identity disorder, or other dissociative disorders, it can take 5 to up to 12 years for somebody to get the correct diagnosis. I find that unacceptable,
Yeah.
unbelievable. I would like to be able to help change that, because then it will most importantly benefit the individual who is suffering,
Yeah.
because they get a diagnosis faster, so they will be healthier faster, they will be happier faster. But on top of that, it will also reduce the waiting list for other people who need mental health care.
Yeah.
And that doesn't need people who have as a severe disorder as dissociative PTSD or DID, but it will also help people who have a depression and need help with that,
Yeah.
because it all builds up on top of each other.
Do you see a difference? I mean, you're in the UK, I'm in the United States. I know we have lots of folks also in Australia and New Zealand that are invested in this care. I mean, it's really an international phenomenon. We see dissociation across different countries. We see a little bit more of the research, or I do from my perspective, in the US, Canada, and UK. Do you have a sense of where the care for DID is best?
I actually think the struggle for the appropriate care is similar across the countries that you have referred to.
Yeah.
Because here in the UK, we have a couple of specialized centers. For example, the Clinic for Dissociative Studies here in London, but they are specialized clinics. They are not mainstream embedded in the national healthcare system, the NHS.
Mm-hmm.
In the Netherlands as well, there are specialized treatment centers. And it takes a long time to get from your GP through the mainstream healthcare system to this specialized center.
Mm-hmm.
Awareness should be much earlier on. For example, even at the GP, I've had discussions with my GP when he asked, "Oh, what actually are you doing for a living?" And then he said, "Oh, well, I've never seen a patient like that." I'm like, "Well, exactly. That's exactly the problem."
Yeah.
Because you probably don't have you have not been trained.
Yeah.
You have not been trained to recognize this.
Yeah.
If I just may elaborate a little bit more on training, here in the UK, there's not an MSc program that you can follow on dissociation.
Wow.
And I have written proposals like this is important.
Yeah.
Now we need to train people. We need to do it at, undergraduate level, graduate level, where medicine, people who study medicine, they need to learn about what is dissociation.
Absolutely.
How do you recognize? But if there's no training in an early phase, then the recognition is, will come too late. And that is what we see now, that it takes so long for somebody to can get the right diagnosis. And this also links back in to who would my research and other people's research help?
Yeah.
Well, with more recognition and more research out, hopefully it will trickle down
Yes.
to undergraduate level. Like, okay, we need to develop courses on this. We need to develop courses to train people sooner on the recognition. What is dissociation?
Yes. And if we do that, I mean, I go back to what you mentioned earlier, which is the same statistics I've heard of, 5, 7, even 12 years for people to get an accurate diagnosis. And when you think about, I mean, we can think about this just in medical terms. People have sometimes had medical issues where they're struggling and going to different doctors and trying to get understood, and they have to end up in this specialty clinic to understand it was their kidney, it wasn't their liver, or whatever, right? Like that process, most of us can maybe relate to that a little bit more if we haven't had serious mental health issues and been in the system. We can relate to having something going on with our body and going, no, that's not quite right. This person isn't getting it right. This medication isn't working. That's a struggle. Like that is uncomfortable. That is impacting that person, their experience of life. It's impacting their family, their friends, their workplace, wherever, whatever they're touching, that process of not being diagnosed.
Their children,
Their children.
the children's education, the next generation.
Yeah. And so when we have a way to understand and get clear diagnosis sooner, whether that's for a physical ailment or it's for a mental health condition or it's for something like dissociation, which, interestingly, I think of most mental health challenges or issues, they're biopsychosocial, right? They're not just, it's not just in your head. It's not even just in your brain. It's biology, it's psychology, it's social relationships, it's, relates to career. And like you said, it can impact even how youth and even generations are raised. So people getting an accurate diagnosis and getting treatment sooner dispels or makes unnecessary years of suffering, not only for the individual, but for everyone that person is connected to. And when we talk about trauma and intergenerational trauma, I do want to have Dr. Rachel Yehuda on the show as well to talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma. So I don't think it's going to happen this season, but hopefully soon. We can really shift things in a profound way where it impacts a lot of people. Someone listening might want these resources for themselves. Like, can I figure out if I have DID? What kind of PTSD do I have? Can I get a brain scan? Right? Like that is helpful initiative to try to understand, what we're going through. But other folks who might think, oh, this doesn't really apply to me, it really impacts the soup we swim in, right? And the people, our communities, and our general sense of mental health and even our societal structures.
Absolutely. Yes, the societal impact is huge for the person, but also financially. The numbers that we just talked about, like £1 million, that sounds a lot. But if you think about 1% or 1.5% of people with DID who have been trying to get the right diagnosis for 12 years, 5 to 12 years, and they have been in ambulances and A&E and to their GP and have had scans for all kinds of psychosomatic pains. How much money does that cost?
Right. Quite a lot.
And then I'm only talking about the money aspect, because you have already raised and discussed all the other aspects.
And we haven't even talked about the professional or career oriented context too, where if someone has any, physical or mental health challenge, if they can get help with that and get support and have it be addressed, well, then they're going to have more energy to contribute to whatever their work is, right? I mean, some people are very high functioning. I don't want to make it sound like they're not. Some people with physical and mental health issues can be very high functioning at work. But generally speaking, if you're having to spend those 5, 7, 12 years going to doctors, that's time that, you can't spend elsewhere. So I want to wrap up, and I just want to restate for folks who may be just listening for the first time and hearing about your research for the first time, restate what dissociation looks like from this neurological perspective, right? What might people continue to look for in themselves or in their research studies, right? What might help them identify and differentiate dissociation?
I can answer that very short. That
Yeah.
is frontal and parietal brain activation and decreased hippocampal volume.
Decreased hippocampal volume and frontal and parietal activation.
Brain activation. And if people want to have more details on the biomarkers of dissociation, they can best read the review that I published in 2021 that describes 4 types of biomarker categories, because we have not even talked about hormones, we have not talked about genetics, all these aspects I have reviewed, but the take-home message from that paper are the frontal and parietal brain activation and decreased hippocampal volume. Those I would call biomarkers for dissociation.
Lovely. So we'll link to that paper in the show notes as well, so people can go and read it directly. And what's next for you? What are your current or upcoming projects?
At the moment, like I said earlier, at the moment I'm working on trying to get my papers published on the basis of the data that I have, and supporting my PhD students. And I'm planning to submit my grant proposal that got very good review scores. I'm planning to resubmit that in September. Just have to collect my energy, submit another grant, and hopefully the time is right then.
Yes. I'm pulling for you over here.
I know, Lisa, and I know a lot of people are, but it's just what I have to work with at the moment. And I think it also helps me to get good feedback on my grant proposals. And I know it's a funder's decision.
Yeah.
Because they have all these grant proposals lying on their table.
Right.
And all of them all have excellent and exceptional ratings.
Yeah.
And then at some point, their board has to decide which proposals they are going to fund. And they cannot fund all excellent and exceptional reviewed projects. At the moment, from what I see, they go with psychosis, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, but very little on dissociation. I know there's a large project running on more on dissociation in younger adults, adolescents, but that is more dissociation in general terms, not specific study of clinical dissociation in DID and dissociative PTSD. And that is really my niche, what I have been working on. And that is also, I've decided that for myself as well. That is also what I would like to do with my life, because I've had colleagues who have asked me, oh, why don't you just write a grant proposal on psychosis or schizophrenia? Because I worked on in the psychosis department for a while. And I learned a lot there, and I'm grateful for that time there. But it's just not what I want to do with my life.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what energizes me.
Yeah.
This is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm going to give it another try. Hopefully, I can continue. And if not, I hope other groups in the world, like the group in Harvard, they just continue and pump out the important work.
I think they will take it and run with it. And I hope that that's gratifying for you. I know it is hard to be a pioneer and to be in this place where, and I think one of the reasons funding has been so challenging is because of what your research does, which is build understanding of dissociation, right? So because there isn't an understanding of dissociation, it's a little bit of this like chicken and the egg thing. Then there's not as much funding, and then you're left struggling, although you have this phenomenal research. And so I hope there's a turn around the corner and that there's some good funding coming through for you soon. And if folks have any resources on funding or just an interest in your work, how could they connect with you and support you?
Well, my email address is on most of on my papers. I think there's a system via KCL if they find me. King's College London. Sorry, I always call it KCL, but King's College London. I still have a web page there because I still have an honorary affiliation with King's College, and I'm on Twitter as well.
Nice.
Don't look, but even they can even contact you or somebody else that they have contact information from, and then they can contact me. I'm not that hard to find.
And I just have one last question as we wrap up. I think doing this type of work and coming up against the systemic challenges that you've come up against and dealing with something that's such a serious and challenging and for many people long-term mental health challenge, what brings you hope as you're doing this type of work?
What gives me hope? Well, what drives me, what gives me still gives me the energy is the feedback I get from the community that you are part of, Lisa, but also from individuals with DID who sent me email that explaining how much my work has changed their lives, or that my research is being used in textbooks in the Netherlands to educate the next generation of psychotherapists.
Yes.
I feel greatly honored by that, but that also gives me energy to keep going.
And I hope you continue and keep going. I know Christine Forner, who came on to an earlier episode of this show, I told her I was interviewing you today, and she said, please tell her I think she should be awarded a Nobel Prize for medicine and physiology. I will pass that on. I know it's hard when, there's
some money involved with the Nobel Prize, but I would be happy with only the money.
Just want the grant. Yeah. Well, I hope you get the recognition and the grant. And I just want to thank you for your time today and for, all the research you've done. I feel like, we talked earlier about favorite studies, and, now I'm waffling because you've done so much great work, but I feel like the meta-analysis that you've done, as well as, the most popular paper of really putting the fantasy model and the biomarker model side by side.
Lisa, can I say one more thing about a paper that I have written that I think might be a nice start off for listeners who do not know much about imaging or about dissociation? That is the editorial that I wrote with Professor Feldman in the British Journal of Psychiatry. And that is from last year. And it's an editorial, and it's more easier access. So that might be a nice paper for people to start. The title is Dissociative Identity Disorder, Out of the Shadows at Last.
Okay.
And I think this is also when people ask me for information or a starting point for starting to read the literature on imaging and DID, this I would give as a starting point for a paper.
It's a great place to start. And I know there's so much more you could share, especially if we were using slides. So maybe we'll circle back with you on that, or folks can look on YouTube to see if, you have a lecture that comes live there. I think it'd be a great resource for people.
I agree.
So thank you, Dr. Reinders, for all your time and all the energy and effort you've put into your research. And I hope this episode helps folks access that research, make sense of that research, apply it, and really just understand complex trauma and dissociation at a more neurological level, in a more concrete way, and in a way that helps people get care faster and better.
Exactly, because in the end, that's what it's all about.
Yes, 100% agree. Thanks so much for listening. My hope is that you walk away from these episodes feeling supported and like you have a place to come to find the hope and inspiration you need to take your next small step forward. For more information and resources, please visit my website, howwecanheal.com. There, you'll find tons of helpful resources and the full transcript of each show. You can also click the podcast menu to submit requests for upcoming topics and guests. I look forward to hearing your ideas.